Hello, this is Hector Vladimir. Today is the 15th of November, 2024. I'd like to discuss some of the top suspects in the Jonbenet Ramsey murder case from 1996. A little bit of background. Jonbenet Ramsey was a 6-year-old child that was murdered in Boulder, Colorado in December 26, 1996. That is the day after Christmas. Jonbenet Ramsey and her parents, John and Patricia Ramsey, were at their friend's Christmas party on Christmas night. They went home after the party was over, and reportedly they put Jonbenet to bed. She was either asleep or falling asleep as she arrived at the house with her parents. And the next morning, they had a trip to another city. I believe it was out of state. They had a flight as a family trip to spend days after Christmas there. And that morning, on December 26th, Patricia Ramsey, was up along with John Ramsey. She came downstairs. They lived in a 2-level home to prepare something in the kitchen, and she found a note, a 2.5-page ransom note that made many demands and that stated that they had kidnapped their child, Jonbenet Ramsey. Patsy reportedly ran upstairs and checked on Jonbenet's room, and indeed she was missing. She immediately notified John hysterically, and they both were looking for the child in the rooms in her bedroom and their other child's bedroom, which was Burke Ramsey. They could not find her, and they quickly called the police, 911. The 911 recording or call is recorded, and it is one of the most infamous recordings in crime history, where Patsy very frankly pleads for the police to come and help them, and she states that she found a ransom note and that her 6-year-old child was missing. This was about close to 6 a.m. in the morning, a few minutes before 6 a.m. in the morning on December 26th. When the police arrived, they conducted a brief investigation. There were other people other than the Ramseys at the house. There were the Ramseys' friends. I believe it was the Whites and the Bernies, which were both couples and friends of the family. There may have been another person, a religious leader, a reverend, that arrived either around that time in the morning or later on. But the police treated the situation as a kidnapping at that time, and there was quite a bit of people running around and doing things. Of course, the police made some mistakes to begin with, very big mistakes, very blatant mistakes, in failing to secure the crime scene. Whatever they thought the situation was, it was a crime scene at the moment. It was a kidnapping crime scene at that moment. So they failed to secure it, and they allowed people to move around, move things, clean things even, and make all kinds of changes to the scene, which is an absolute mistake for any kind of police investigation and work. Later on, as the time goes, before I move on, the ransom note did make some threats about contacting the police, and they also made some demands about a ransom and a communication, a call that was supposed to take place between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. that morning. That call or communication never occurred, even though the police was expecting it, and I believe they had already set up some equipment to intercept the call. However, the call never came. Later that morning, Jonbenet's body was found in the house by John Ramsey and a friend. I believe his name was Fleet White. It was found in a obscured and remote room in the home's basement. It was a room within the basement, and the body was found strangled and stiff with rigor mortis. Later on, the autopsy revealed that Jonbenet had died perhaps many hours before, most likely that night of the 25th, or very early in the morning on the 26th, or very late at night on the 25th. So the time of death is estimated, give or take a few hours, to be around 11:30 p.m. on December the 25th. So the autopsy also revealed that the child had ate right before going to bed that night, and she had ate a fruit. Many believe it was pieces of pineapple, which were found in her stomach. She was also strangled. She was also found to have been sexually molested. There was evidence of that. And there was DNA found on her clothing and under her fingernails of an unknown individual or individuals that is not of the family, not living in the house, and also it is not anyone close to the family. It is believed that this DNA likely belongs to the killer, but this is not absolute. This is not an absolute finding that it must be the case. There is a chance that this DNA may come from someone that is innocent, perhaps someone that the child came in contact with that is not part of the family or has not been investigated, or DNA from one person or more than one person that may have come in contact with her clothing, whether it's the manufacturer or someone else. So that is a brief background. There are many more details, of course, but with that, I would like to discuss the top few suspects. I would like to begin. There are two camps. One camp of theory says that there was an intruder, someone completely outside from the house and unrelated to the family, came in and broke into the home, or broke an entry, somehow very carefully broke into the home. Someone or some people, may have been more than one person, but that is very unlikely because the entry points were very few. The possible entry points were very few, and the perpetrator, if there was one, left very little evidence behind. Almost no evidence. Very little evidence as far as items, as far as marks, as far as obvious entry points, obvious breakages of locks, of door handles or windows. Those were pretty much intact. There were a few possible entry points, however. I'm not going to go into the details of those, but there are a handful, maybe 2 to 3, that are, although unlikely, they are possible entry points. And the intruder theory basically postulates that an intruder broke into the home either most likely before the Ramseys arrived that night, late on the 25th of December. The intruder broke in before the Ramseys arrived, while their home was vacant. There was no alarm system on, and they hid somewhere in the house. They waited until the Ramseys were asleep, all of them, and then proceeded to somehow disable JonBenét or render her unconscious or unable to scream, make any kind of noise, and proceeded to take her from her room and assault her, and then eventually kill her, and then wrap her in a blanket. And the method of murder there were two. One was a blunt trauma to the head with some object, which the object or the weapon used is unclear, but it was. Some believe it was a mag light, flashlight. Others believe it was other object that may have been used. The objects, of course, do not have JonBenét's DNA. The mag light, flashlight, I believe, did not have JonBenét's DNA on it. May have been wiped clean, who knows, but it is somewhat unlikely that it won't have any DNA at all. So another object may have been used. So it is not clear, or it is unknown, or no object was found that could have been used that had JonBenét's DNA on it, or any other intruders or possible intruders' DNA on it. The second method of the murder was a garrote device that was made and used on the child's neck for strangulation and asphyxiation, that may have been used as the primary way of killing the child, or as a secondary way. It's really unclear what came first, the blow to the head or the strangulation. The child had also her hands tied and was also perhaps silenced with duct tape. She had duct tape on her mouth. Some believe the duct tape was put after death or after the child was completely disabled. Some believe that there is uncertainty and it is unknown when the tape was placed, whether it was before the child was unconscious or after. So jumping to the first and perhaps the most likely suspect, maybe many people believe that this person may be the most likely suspect. There are two that are highly important and central suspects. The first one is Michael Helgoth, and the other one is Gary Oliva. So just to tackle the first suspect, which he is no longer alive, it is Michael Helgoth. Michael Helgoth was a young person. I believe he was probably in his 20s, that lived in Boulder, Colorado at the time of JonBenet's death. He lived in a property inside of a salvage yard or junk yard in the area. He served in the military, I believe, for close to a year or around a year. The reasons why he didn't serve longer are uncertain to me. I don't believe it's that important for the purposes of this chat. And the reason why him serving in the military is somewhat key or important is because in the ransom note that I mentioned that was found, there were some military statements, military terms that were used, or that were likely used by someone with familiarity with military terms, such as tactics, countermeasures, the violent nature of the threats, were somewhat of someone that may be familiar with military conflict, combat. The garrote was likely made by someone with familiarity with the military, likely the Navy or naval forces, but could be also someone familiar with survival tactics, survival methods, and familiar with making different types of knots with rope or any other kind of fabric. Another detail also that was very important, there was a high-tech boot print of unknown origin found in the crime scene in JonBenet's house. There was also a scuff mark of unknown origin in the wall somewhere in the crime scene in the Ramsey's home, and also there was a shoe print on a suitcase that was placed under a window that may have been used as an exit point or entry point or both for an outside intruder into the house. And I just want to bring up about that entry point. That window was in the basement. It was a very small window high up, and it was broken and open, yes, but it was immediately broken by John Ramsey, which is JonBenet's father. And he admittedly broke the window before the crime, perhaps weeks or months before, to gain entry into the house because he had locked himself out of the house. And also that entry window had cobwebs on it that were likely made by spiders or a spider many days, weeks, or months before the crime, and it was undisturbed or largely undisturbed, which is very unlikely for an individual to climb through that window and not disturb the cobweb. And of course this cobweb was photographed by the police after the murder. Also there was a grate covering the window, which was apparently undisturbed, was found undisturbed with foliage. Also there were no footprints in the snow that morning as reported by the police. So going back to Michael Helgoth as a suspect, he was found to have owned stun guns. There was a mark on JonBenet's body discovered by her autopsy that had marks very similar to marks left behind by the contact with a stun gun. So some people believe, some investigators such as Lou Smith believe a stun gun may have been used to disable and render JonBenét Ramsey unconscious and unable to scream as she was taken from her room. And this person, Michael Helgoth, owned stun guns. It is unclear, however, if the stun gun that he owned matched the distance between the two marks found on JonBenet's body, which are, stun guns usually have two electrodes separated perhaps by a few inches or millimeters, and it is unclear whether his stun gun or stun guns matched this distance. Another important detail was that Michael Helgoth died shortly after I believe it was close to a month after JonBenét's death, by a single shotgun wound to the chest. It is unclear whether it was suicide or there was foul play involved. I believe no foul play was determined or found by the investigation of his death. So I believe it was largely or mostly, if not completely, ruled a suicide. However, only because it was ruled a suicide does not mean that's exactly what it was. But the evidence points towards a suicide, in other words. Another detail is that Michael Helgoth's body, or the autopsy on his body, discovered that he was on drugs at the time of death. Another detail about Michael Helgoth is that he was acquainted with two gentlemen that may have been, if true, if the theory that he was involved was true, he was involved with two gentlemen that may have something to do with this case. Their names were John Kennedy and another gentleman by the name of Steve. His full name was John Stephen Gygax. Well, let's call them John and Steve. So John and Steve lived in a trailer park close to Boulder, or in Boulder, Colorado, close to the junkyard where Michael Helgoth lived. And there's another twist to the story that adds a bit of complexity. This is thanks to Nancy Drew. He has a pretty good video on that. I'll put the link on the description. The name of the person that lived in Golden, Colorado, which was close to Boulder, Colorado. She had a horse ranch in that city, and her name was Vernice Johnson. And she had a daughter with a gentleman, and her daughter, Cinnamon, was in the beauty pageant circuit. She was around the same age as JonBenét, so there is a possibility, this is unclear and unknown to my knowledge, but there is a possibility, according to the video and the report by Nancy Drew, there's a possibility that Cinnamon was in the pageant competition in an event, or perhaps more than one event, together with JonBenét in the Denver, Colorado area, where JonBenét may have been exposed to these individuals, John Kennedy and the gentleman called Steve, since they were acquainted with Vernice Johnson. And when asked, Vernice Johnson, she reports that she knows who killed JonBenét, and she says that it was Kevin Fuse, together with someone else, an unknown person. And she also adds that this other unknown person is from the junkyard in Boulder, Colorado. And just to remind you, the person of interest that lived in the junkyard was Michael Helgoth. Also, John Kennedy, the two gentlemen that lived in the junkyard in Boulder, report that he knows who killed JonBenét Ramsey, and he says it was Michael Helgoth with someone else, an unknown person. So the theory goes that John Stephen Gygax, or Stephen, together with Michael Helgoth, learned about JonBenét through seeing her in one of her beauty pageant competition. Steve was the one that more likely was exposed to her. He does have, or did have, a criminal background for sexual assault, and they plotted to kidnap her, and it was talked about between the two, between Stephen and Michael Helgoth, and it was a kidnapping gone wrong. That is the theory forwarded and as reported by Nancy Drew again, and it is somewhat viable because of the pieces of evidence that were found to be owned by Michael Helgoth and the fact that he was either murdered or killed by suicide shortly after JonBenét's death. And the theory says or goes that he was likely killed by Stephen, who shut him up because he was perhaps threatening to speak or to tell on him about the crime. Hello, this is Hector Vladimir. Today is the 15th of November 2024, and just to continue with my comments on the suspects of the JonBenét Ramsey case, the suspect Gary Oliva was one of the top suspects in the intruder theory, and for a few good reasons. Gary Oliva was in the Boulder area when JonBenét was murdered in December 25th, 1996. Gary Oliva, he was a homeless man, again, that lived near the Ramseys, or that hung around near where the Ramseys lived, and he also visited the church often, the church that the Ramseys visited. Gary Oliva was reported as owning a pair of high-tech boots, which were the type of boot prints found on the crime scene. Not sure how popular those boots are. I've seen them, and I believe they are among the cheaper brands of boots out there, so I'm guessing quite a few stores may carry those. Not exactly how much they sell. I would have to probably look that up and update this chat, or how much they sold back in 1996, to see if it's something that a lot of people had, was quite popular, or a best sold or good sold pair of shoes or boots. That could make a difference whether they were rare or quite popular. In the investigation, in the suspicion of people that owned those type of boots, but a shoe print was found on the suitcase that was placed under the window that was open and broken in the basement. Again, admittedly broken by John Ramsey on a night or day that he was locked out of the house, and he gained access by getting into the house through that window. However, it is unclear whether any intruder may have also used the same entry point. Gary Oliva was a registered sex offender, along with about 38 others that lived in the Boulder area. As a side note, there were about 100 burglaries reported in and around the time that JonBenét Ramsey died or was killed. And Gary Oliva was a sex offender, having committed a sex crime with minors, I believe. So Gary Oliva was a convicted pedophile. He raises suspicion, not only because of his vicinity to JonBenét Ramsey and her family, but also because he attended a candlelight vigil for JonBenét Ramsey, presumably in Boulder. However, many other people did attend a vigil. It was quite a popular or a publicized event, tragedy. So that by itself is not an indication of guilt. However, it should be accounted together with the other pieces of evidence. He was also known to carry a piece of duct tape, and if you recall, JonBenét had been placed a piece of duct tape on her mouth as she was assaulted and or killed the night of December 25th or morning of December 26th. Oliva also had photos of JonBenét Ramsey. Reportedly, he had a whole bunch of magazine or tabloid magazine cutouts, and reportedly, I have to verify this because this is kind of baffling for 1996, having pictures in someone's phone. I'm not sure how prevalent that was in 1996. That was the age where cell phones were quite brute and basic, and were not at all smart or with touch screens or even with any screens at all. So I'm not sure what they said, how they said in the report that I heard that he had hundreds of pictures related to JonBenét Ramsey on his phone. That is kind of odd. At that time, I would think he had probably pictures in a floppy disk, some sort of recording device on a VHS tape. This is 1996. This is way before smartphones came around, or even phones with screens and the capability to store photos, and let alone hundreds of them. So that is kind of a question I have there for clarification. Also, Gary Oliva was reported to own at least one stun gun, which he reportedly said a friend gave it to him for protection because he was worried about his safety, something of the sort. Again, Gary Oliva was found to possess child pornography. He also, interestingly, had about 20 photos of JonBenét Ramsey's autopsy, which were leaked to the press, I believe. And he also had made a shrine to JonBenét Ramsey. Not sure how or where. If it was a portable shrine where he carried it around, or it was something that he made on a permanent, semi-permanent location, and he visited it. And he was also said to have written a poem dedicated to the memory of JonBenét. A high school friend of his called Michael Vale reported that Oliver called him shortly after JonBenet's death or murder, where he reportedly confessed to him that he had hurt a little girl. Apparently he did not mention JonBenét by name, but this is a statement allegedly from Oliver to his friend Mr. Michael Vale. So he was clearly obsessed with JonBenét Ramsey, with these many things, and he was also quite knowledgeable and up to date, and again obsessed with the JonBenét Ramsey murder case. He had been reading on it, watching reports on it, etc. However, he was obviously cleared, since he was never charged by the Boulder Police Department or any other agency investigating the crime. His handwriting samples did not match the ransom notes. That was one piece of evidence that exonerated him, I guess. He also was not a match for the DNA, which I assume and suppose that it is a pretty big factor that exonerated him as well. It seems to be a factor that exonerated a lot of individuals. I guess they have put a tremendous amount of weight on the DNA, even though the DNA is pretty much inconclusive as to it was the perpetrator that left such DNA. There is really not a absolute way to know whether the DNA was even from one single individual, let alone from an individual that had committed the crime, let alone with any kind of certainty. However, it seems that there's a tremendous amount of weight and credence given to this DNA. So Oliver, having not matched the DNA, he was apparently also cleared, or this contributed to his clearance or exoneration. So that's the character. Oliver also served additional time after JonBenet's death in jail or prison, or both, where he confessed to inmates or someone, or perhaps the news, I'm not really certain, but he confessed somehow that he had been the one that killed JonBenét and he had done it as an accident. I believe he wrote a letter where he made this confession while in jail or prison. So that is John Oliver, which is or was a top suspect for the JonBenét Ramsey case, if an intruder indeed was the culprit. Thank you for listening to this podcast or watching this video. Please subscribe, like, and share so you can support this work and so I can reach more people like you. If you'd like to support this content further, please click on the links provided here. Thank you again. Have a great day.